Okay, welcome back. So we are on the last lecture of Unit 3, the lecture on representation. We'll probably have to make this a three-parter. So when we were last talking, we were talking about how representation is often, in many situations, and definitely for many cultures, it's not so much about being truthful to the thing that you're representing, but truthful to the thing you want to say about the thing, right? To the concept you're emphasizing. Um, and like here's another example that kind of stretches our boundaries of what we think of representation. We've seen this painting once or twice already in the class. We talked about it a little bit. It's an example of abstract expressionism. We talked about it a little bit when we were talking about figure ground. But today I want to talk about it from the point of view of, I will make the case that this is a representation. You may look at this painting and say it's not a representation, it's just shapes on a canvas. But of course, all representations are just shapes on canvas if they're painted on canvas. And here is my proof as to why this is a representation. Robert Motherwell started making this kind of motif of kind of three lines, and each line and the lines are squeezing, and there are these kind of egg-shaped, kind of rounded sort of volumes squeezed between the lines. He started making these sometime, I think, in like the late 40s, early 50s. And first he made them just as works on paper, and he then started to make lots of them as works on paper. He started to make them as paintings, and large scale paintings, and he made multiple versions of this kind of motif in slight different variations, some where we see more of this shape, some where we see less, some where this shape is more cropped off, some where lines like these two lines are added, some where these edges are more agitated, some where they're less. But basically the same kind of motif over and over again in large-scale paintings. And then he also repeated them in prints. And every time, whether he made them as small works on paper or canvas works, every time he always titled it the same thing: Elegy for the Spanish Republic. So what does that mean? That means that this motif means something specific about the death of the Spanish Republic, the death of that ideal, this hope that people had that we would support a Republican and a leftist government against fascists right before World War II, but then that Europe and America and Canada basically left those Spanish idealists, left them to die, and allowed the Franco-fascists to win. And so this painting is about that. Now, how it represents that, I can't quite tell you. I think you could certainly make the case of the idea of like masses being squeezed by forces that are beyond their control. Maybe. Only Robert Motherwell really knew, and he's not telling us now. But the more important thing is that we know it was specific for him. So therefore, just by that nature, it is a representation. Here are two more examples that I think kind of push the boundaries, right? Fundamentally, this is, what we would think of as an extremely realistic representation, because it is a photograph, and it's a very, very clear and crisp photograph, but it's a photograph of a space that is so disorienting, right? So patterny, so confusing that it becomes an abstraction, right? Like if we didn't have the skyline back there, it would be almost impossible to see this image as anything other than just some elaborate, complex abstraction of pattern and shapes. But we can see that it's a space. This is actually a race course, by the way, in Bahrain, right? Like a Formula One race course. Now let's look at the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, right? The Veterans Memorial, it would be easy to see as non-representational, right? It is simply a wall carved into the earth. But consider for a moment that it is a very accurate and very poignant representation of a war. Think of it this way. When you walk up to the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, right, you start at one end, right? And if you start at this corner right there, you start at the beginning of the war. And as you're walking along, the wall starts to have names on it, the names of people who are dying. the people who are dying each month, each year in the war. And that list starts to get more and more. And as the number of people dying gets more and more, the height of the wall increases and it grows until it dwarfs ahead of you. And then by the time you're down to the bottom of this kind of wound in the earth, by the time you get down to the bottom, right, you're at the height of the war where we are losing the most lives per day. And then as you walk out, you're moving into the period as we are starting to slowly extract ourselves from the war in various cowardly manners that we could have done better. But the basic point is it becomes an extremely accurate, in some ways, an extremely moving, in many ways, representation of a brutal and unpleasant event in our history. So once again, what is representation? One of the cases I would make is that representation happens even when artists try not to have representation happen. Right? Here's a pretty famous painting, white on white, sometimes called white square on white, by Malevich. I think this is the one that's at the, there are a couple of them. I think this is the one that's at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And that's the one I've seen. And it is an amazing painting to see in person. It's truly gorgeous. And I'll explain in another unit why exactly I think it's truly gorgeous. But for right now, let's just deal with the issue that here's a painting that's trying to be as much as possible a painting of nothing, right? It is simply a white square on a white field. If it's about anything at all, it's just about the slight change of color from the cool white that's a little bit lighter to the warm light that's a little bit darker, and little changes of surface. But it is so much more than that, right? Because it immediately implies a space and a thing. There's an implication of action because the square is on an angle. It implies a potential of story and definitely a potential of representation. Here's another example. Philip Guston tried in the early 60s. He tried desperately to get rid of all elements of narrative and of representation from his work, but he found that no matter what he did, if he put a couple of shapes in the painting, then representation happened, whether he intended it or not. So what is real, right? So hopefully I have convinced you that representation itself is kind of a complex issue. But when we say something is real or realistic, what do we mean? Well, here's a work of art that definitely argues that what is real is debatable. This painting is called The Treachery of Images, and its primary point is to remind you that an image of the thing is not a thing, right? It says in French, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," right? This is not a pipe. And it is exactly correct. It is not a pipe, right? Because it's a painting of a pipe. And it's actually quite stylized painting of a pipe at that. So hopefully now we can look at something like the Venus of Willendorf and see it more realistically, more accurately, and see that it is not this aberration, this bizarre, weird thing where people represented the human form in such an extreme, unusual manner. It's actually part of a much larger tradition that generally, all right, that's my 1 minute warning. Last point I'm going to make before part 3. Generally, when humans represent things, especially when they represent human beings, they represent a point about the thing, a point about human beings, or about what they're saying human beings represent. It's not about making it look exactly like a person. It's about making it look exactly about what they're saying. Okay, that's where I'm going to end for now. I'll meet you at part 3.